When buying and selling is controlled by legislation, the first ones to be bought are the legislators. Good evening and welcome. This is Face the Nation. Our topic of discussion today is the role of the IMF and the future of the country's economy. Joining us tonight on the show are Damit Palwata, Senior Banker, Dr. Howard Nicholas, Economist and Associate Professor at International Institute of Social Studies, along with Dhananath Fernando, Chief Operating Officer, Advocata Institute. Nice to have you back on the show, Dhananath, after some time. And also joining us tonight via Zoom is Jerome De Silva, veteran actor as well as stage director. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining us this evening on Face the Nation. Let's get this ball rolling today with Dr. Howard Nicholas, Economist and Associate Professor at International Institute of Social Studies. Dr. Nicholas, why are we in this mess right now? Today, the Minister of Finance, along with the Governor of the Central Bank and the Secretary of the Ministry of Treasury, are visiting the IMF in Washington, D.C. to discuss about a bailout plan. But let's discuss about why are we in this mess first. What is the reason behind it? Is it sheer mismanagement by the government that has led to this crisis at present? Your time starts now.
Well, it is mismanagement, but it's not what is popularly believed, that it's the budget deficit. So this is the starting point for everybody, it's the budget deficit resulting in printing of too much money. I think this is really looking at the symptom and not the cause. For me, the fundamental cause has been there for a very long time. Actually, I've traced it back to at least the early 90s, but it went even before that, and that is a trade deficit. So Sri Lanka, almost uniquely, has had a 30-year period of minus 10% of GDP, minus 10% of GDP trade imbalance. You can't continue like that. What this situation does is it creates a vulnerability that any shock to the system, any shock, immediately catapults Sri Lanka towards debt problems. And especially when reserves are precariously low, then when you're hit with a shock, you invariably have reserve problems. So for me, this is the fundamental problem. And my difficulty with the current debate is that, as I said, the symptom is mistaken for the cause. And for me, just treating that symptom is not going to solve Sri Lanka's problems. We've been through it before. We've had, especially under President Chandrika Kumaratunga, I remember the IMF came in, and I'm guessing they'll do roughly the same thing, and that is focus on the budget deficit and controlling money supply. Obviously raising interest rates, depreciating the currency. Well, I don't think it needs to be depreciated that much, but I don't know what's in the mind of the IMF. But what I can predict is that we're likely to have a recurrent problem a few years down the line, because we won't be addressing the more fundamental problem, and that is the trade imbalance. And we've been continuously doing this all the time. And my problem, and that's how we started, is when you mention mismanagement, this is for me the fundamental mismanagement. And it's not just this government, it's previous governments that have done the same thing. The question is why they have not addressed that more fundamental problem. The only time I've seen it addressed is under the presidency of President Premadasa. And then we had improvement in the trade balance, actually not during his presidency, but immediately after, once the policies worked their way through the system. Then we got a dramatic improvement in the trade balance. But this was frittered away by President Kumaratunga because she overvalued the currency. She didn't continue the export-oriented policies of President Premadasa. And then we got into the current type of syndrome that we now have, which is more or less a service-oriented economy with little or no attention to the trade balance.
Dr. Nicholas, if you look at the recent past, in particularly the last 2 years, people are pointing the finger at the government. Why? Because of the reduction in broadening the tax regime in Sri Lanka. There was issues with regard to the collection of 600 billion rupees of taxes. The government cut down these taxes overnight. Then came the fertilizer crisis in Sri Lanka as well. Today, President Gotabaya Rajapaksa has taken a complete U-turn and said that he apologizes to the mistakes that have been taken in the past, and that the way forward is to provide the fertilizer subsidy to the farmers in Sri Lanka who are in dire need of fertilizer at the moment. This in turn reduced our export revenue as well, like the agricultural crops. So there was sheer economic mismanagement, arrogance on the part of the former governor of the central bank, who steadfastly said that we will move forward to a domestic process in terms of sourcing the funds required for the country's economy. All this and more, hasn't it affected the country's economy at large?
Yes, I mean, I personally point to two particular policies. You mentioned the agricultural subsidy, but I would go back to the decimation of the tax base. So this is one thing. And secondly, lowering interest rates. If you, as a developing country, we cannot pursue demand management policies in the way advanced countries can. So therefore, we cannot run budget deficits and spur the economy. This no developing country does. And this is the first and most important lesson that we have, is you don't do something like that. So if the IMF comes in and rectifies that and says, no, you have to once again raise your tax rates and broaden the tax base, I think that's fine. But the second thing is, you do not reduce interest rates again to manage demand. This is for advanced countries. This is not for developing countries. Because what you're then going to do is hemorrhage foreign exchange. People will borrow and import, and you will get into this problem of actually sucking in imports as a result of both of these policies. Again, a country like the United States can do that, and that's exactly what they did in 2020. But they print world money. Sri Lanka prints rupees, and no one in the world accepts the rupees. So this type of policy is doomed to failure.
Dr. Nicholas, I don't know whether you are aware, but one of the strongmen of the previous cabinet attached to the Gotabaya Rajapaksa regime went on to note at one point that we have a dollar crisis at present, but we don't have a rupee crisis. And that is the amount of knowledge, unfortunately, the ministers of the previous cabinet had. And there's no exception with the new cabinet that was appointed today by the president himself. But having said that, Dr. Nicholas, let's talk about the IMF. You spoke about the IMF. You said that they would prescribe to increasing interest rates, increasing taxes, and widening the tax regime as well. Now we know that these are the prescriptions that would be given by the IMF. Isn't the government still trying to play petty politics, even at this time, even at this moment that we are facing at present, waiting to do things on the advice of the IMF, so they can come back from Washington DC and tell the people of Sri Lanka, this is what the IMF wanted, and hence we are doing it. These are not prescriptions that would be adhered or followed suit by the authorities in the country. Aren't they playing petty politics once again?
I don't know whether they're playing petty politics. I mean, I don't know what is in the mind of ministers when they do what they do. But what I can say is they should be very aware that going to the IMF has always certain negative consequences for our longer-term sustainable strategy. Now, this is why country after country. I mean, we can go through sub-Saharan country after country, Latin American country after country, where the IMF comes in and there's no sustainable solution. We know short term it's going to rectify the problem because you're going to contract demand in the economy. Everyone knows that contracting demand is going to short term solve a currency problem. But what about the long term? What are we thinking about the long term? I don't see any real strategy adopted by this government or previous government. So we go to the IMF, they make all these recommendations. Maybe the government uses that as an excuse to do the things that they should be doing short term. But what about the long term? What are they thinking for the long term? Because if they don't actually pay heed to the long term, we're going to get back into the same mess that we've been in for the past 30 years.
Right, thank you very much, Dr. Howard Nicholas, economist, associate professor at International Institute of Social Studies. While you were talking with your opening remarks, Dr. Nicholas, I've been getting a lot of messages to post to you as the show goes on, and I will do that after the end of the first round. I now move my attention to Dhananath Fernando, Chief Operating Officer at Vikarta Institute. Dhananath, going to the IMF is just the first step, isn't it? We are in a mess at the moment. We've plunged to a level that we've almost declared bankruptcy. We've said that we cannot pay our international sovereign bond holders as well as our international debtors. Given that fact, today's meeting with the IMF, how important is it to the people of Sri Lanka?
Shamir, IMF meeting is very, very important because given the context of Sri Lanka's status at the moment, we are talking about people suffering at streets and our reserve levels are almost zero or negative and we really don't have an option. And IMF talks basically gives you access for other financing channels. But it doesn't mean me being endorsing, seeing like the IMF is the final solution. We have to go for a long journey of economic reforms. If we look at the history of IMF programs, we have been there 16 times. Out of those 16 times, Daniel Alphonsus has recently written on his blog on a detailed analysis on the IMF programs we have gone through. So according to his blog, we have out of 16, we have only completed 6 IMF programs. IMF programs have mainly 2 categories. One is called standby agreements, which are very short term, which is less than 36 months. And if it's more than 36 months, it's the extended fund facilities. So we have gone there for extended fund facilities 6 times, and we have only completed twice the program of the extended fund facility. So that shows our reform commitment has been very, very minimal. But having said that, Shamir, IMF is not the destination. Going to IMF won't solve the problem. It's like if I was having a bad behavior of like unhealthy diet, unhealthy life, if I'm not doing exercises, if my food habits are unhealthy, of course I will end up with diabetes and a heart attack. At that moment, you can't recommend, okay, go back and do exercises again. You have to recommend to go to a doctor. But if you ask like from a healthy person, do I have to go for a doctor? I would say don't go for a doctor because you are a healthy person. But when you are not doing well, you have to go to the doctor and get some medication, so you have to go to the laboratory, get some tests recommended, and all that things have to be done. But ultimately your goal has to be a healthy person. You have to come back and roll your sleeves and get the work done. So IMF is just like a milestone in this entire journey. We have to go with our own reform agenda. That's how I see it, because we know what reforms we need to do. As you mentioned at the start of the show, we have made drastical wrong policy decisions which now have been admitted by the same policy makers that we made a mistake. So we know what went wrong. So we have to recorrect that, but correcting at this point is not easy because you have passed a long time and now our businesses are at the edge of collapsing most of these businesses because of the interruptions of the supply chain. So I don't see IMF is the final solution. Our final solution has to be a massive reform plan, and IMF can assist us just to keep our nose above the water. And when IMF assistance is there, we can go for bridge financing just to float the economy. We can access bilateral partners and some other multilateral partners just to keep floating till we come to some settlement. Otherwise, it will start collapsing further and our economy will deteriorate further than what we see now.
Dharanath, debt sustainability is very important. When you go to the IMF, you have to have a way in which you can pay the debt. If not, they do not provide us with funding. That is the normal theory in which the IMF works. Now we are in a situation that we can't pay the money. So what would be the next step? What would Minister Ali Sabri go to the IMF and tell? What is Governor Nandalal Veerasinghe going to tell the IMF with regard to debt sustainability? What is the new Treasury Secretary going to tell the IMF? Now we know that we cannot pay the debt. In that situation, what is our argument going to be with the IMF?
Yes, Shamir, you are absolutely right. When countries' debt is unsustainable, IMF can't give you money, because IMF has done that mistake before, because then that particular country will get that money and pay your creditors. So IMF can't do that. So IMF can't give you money, but they can come to a staff level agreement on a reform plan with that particular country upon their request. So in this case,
so you're trying to tell us now that they are not going to provide the money as requested or envisaged by the Minister of Finance of $3 billion US. What they're going to give us is technical assistance only.
At the beginning, it is, you're absolutely right, only the technical assistance, but the advantage is we have already suspended our all debt servicing. So now IMF and the entire world knows that we are not going to service our debt anymore. Now the next step is IMF and the government has to come to some sort of an agreement. What is the reform plan that we agree? And based on that, they will give us money on tranches based on our agreement. That takes about generally 3 to 6 months. So what we need is called the bridge financing to float during that period, but definitely don't expect once the finance minister comes back after 3 to 4 days of talks that he will bring $4 billion or $5 billion, because it takes time. But when we come to an agreement with the IMF, it opens up other channels like Asian Development Bank, World Bank. They can support us because they know we are with an IMF program. That's the process, but it takes time. The challenge is to keep the nose above the water in the next coming months. That's where we need bridge financing. Once we have a staff level agreement, then IMF will assist us. I reiterate, IMF is not the destination. It's just a milestone in a longer journey of much deeper economic reforms, and this is a golden opportunity, though it's painful, for us to do the reforms. Otherwise, we will not be able to come out of this crisis in the future.
So Dharanath, you spoke about the ADB as well as the World Bank, who could provide us the bridge financing needed for the country. But I want to make you cognizant, the chief economist of the World Bank for the South Asian region, Hans Trimmer's statement. He says that Sri Lanka is in a precarious situation and we exclude forecast for New Year as there is so much uncertainty in the country. In a situation like this, do you think even the World Bank would come to help Sri Lanka?
When there's an IMF agreement, there's a higher chance. But Shamir, we also have to understand the nature of this economic crisis. What we are is economic crisis, in my view, comes in a package of 5 crises. What we are experiencing is the balance of payment crisis. In other terms, shortage of dollars, so no electricity, no fuel. There's a knock-on effect on all that. The second crisis is the debt crisis, now which has triggered with the announcement of debt suspension. And when we go to the debt restructuring, further pain will come on people because there will be more severe reforms that we have to do which will affect people. Third crisis is the impact on the financial system, because our government has issued a lot of credit guarantees to our state-owned enterprises, and some of these banks have provided loans to the government. So when there's a debt restructuring goes on, they might ask the international sovereign bond instruments may be holding by some other state-owned enterprises. So that if it comes to a point that has to be restructured, there will be stress on the financial institutes. Fourth crisis is the political crisis, because in a country like Sri Lanka, most of the basic utilities like fuel, electricity, water, gas is provided by the government. So when there are interruptions, it's normal that the public pressure comes towards the government, and that's what you are exactly seeing. There's one set of cabinet ministers, they resign, a new set comes, and the pressure will mounting and continue. And the fifth crisis is the humanitarian crisis, which has also now indicated with some of the shortages on pharmaceutical items, and in fact the Singapore announced that they are giving us $100,000 as medical assistance. The problem is, if it's a tsunami, Shamir, the wave comes, goes, and after a few days we can start rebuilding. Now these 5 crises comes in no particular sequence, it comes at any sequence. Now how I see it is, after the balance of payment crisis, our political crisis triggered. Now it comes the debt crisis, humanitarian crisis has also triggered. So, and it's going to stay for some time. So that's the nature of the crisis. So when we go to the debt restructuring, it will further bring painful results. So IMF and the World Bank, as you mentioned, whether they will give, of course there will be a concern on political stability at this point for us to consider, because if there's political instability, they can only support a legitimate government. That's the trick here, or like that's the concern here. So it's important that we find a solution within the constitutional framework.
Right. So in other words, Dhananath, you're saying Minister Ali Sabri, who is the new Minister of Finance, is not going to bring back a pack of goodies to Sri Lanka right after his meeting, but he's going to come with advice, recommendations and technical expertise with regard to how debt needs to be restructured in the country and the way forward.
How debt needs to be restructured, we have issued the RFPs for financial advisors and the legal advisors, but of course the IMF unfortunately is the one and only organization who can assist as a neutral party for the government and also for the creditors to come to some sort of an agreement on the debt restructuring. So I am sure those discussions will happen and the government will say, but this is what we can do, and the IMF will, based on their Article 4 report, will recommend what sort of an adjustment that we need to do, but it has to go through an in-depth analysis and it will take some time.
Right. Thanks a lot, Dhananath Fernando, Chief Operating Officer of the Advocate Institute. I now move my attention to Damit Palwatha, Senior Banker. Joining us via Zoom is also Jerome De Silva, veteran actor as well as stage director. We'll connect with Jerome momentarily, but I want to first pick Damit Palwatha's brain, Senior Banker. Damit, we saw the manner in which how the central bank governor, after taking office a few days after, he increased the basis points in which interest rates are being calculated in Sri Lanka. He increased by approximately around 7 basis points, and today the interest rates are standing at approximately around 14.5. However, if you look at the past, I want to drag your attention to the year 2000. The then central bank governor increased the basis points by 9. That was the highest increase of interest rates in Sri Lanka in the year 2000, and that was seen as a very, very stern decision taken by the central bank of the country at that time. So don't you think that the governor of the central bank needs to look at this also as an option going forward? Because at that time the interest rates were hovering at approximately around 25%. And today it's approximately around 14.5%. And at that time, we were in a crisis, but we were able to source funds from overseas markets. But now it's not the case. So what should be the thinking that should be adopted by the central bank, in your opinion, as a senior banker?
Thank you, Shamir. Let me get an approach to this, the question that you have raised. You spoke of the policy rates, how those policy rates have moved. At one point it has moved 9%, now recently we have seen 7% increase in the policy rates. Before going to the policy rates, let me capitalize on Dr. Nicholas and what Dhananath has said. Yes, Sri Lanka is in a crisis, both political and economic. We didn't have these 2-3 crises together earlier. So it's a unique situation that the Sri Lanka is in. So the wake-up call that we got was the ongoing protest, which has done several changes. So the issue is that with polarized views, nobody wants to come to middle ground to settle over a compromise. So we don't see political stability coming through. But in the meantime, when the new governor came on board, he announced a preemptive default. That is what we call. So it was announced last week. Actually, the default happened today, the 18th. So I would say under the circumstances, it's a clever default. Why I say that? This default exclude three things. One is swaps. So they exclude swaps. Swaps being a reserve instrument. And there are swaps with mainly three countries, Bangladesh, India and China. So that has provided an opportunity to renegotiate or roll on. He kept that options open. And also he kept the option open by excluding multilateral debts. So then we can go and negotiate with ADB or whatever multilateral debt provider for a bridging finance. He kept that option open. And the third, he excluded SLDBs. So taking into account the Sri Lankan banking sector, financial sector is exposed. If you want to minimize the impact to that sector, it's a kind of a clever decision that is made. So where has all these taken us? Now when you say interest policy rates, we have seen policy rates at 12% in the kind of 2007-2009. So then it drops to 9% you spoke of is before that. Then like 2011 to 16, so we were at between 8 and 10, and then it dropped to 5.5%, somewhere during the COVID. Right? Then what happens when these interest rates were reduced? I think Dr. Nicholas brought a very important point. We being a developing country, when you drop your interest rates that much, but your risk-free rate stands very much above that. So you allow interest rate arbitrage. You have seen that is happening over the last, say, couple of years. Your policy rates where the banks go to the central bank in case of liquidity is low, but your risk-free rate, that is treasury bills, was much above, so then you create an arbitrage. And in between you set your prime lending rate, which is the rate that we use to lend to prime corporates.
Right.
So that is also, much below the treasury bill or the risk-free rate. So the adjustment
treasury bill rates are going at approximately around 23%.
now.
Yeah.
If you look at 2020 November, December, it was at the prime lending rate is around 5.5 to 6%. So which was the case until August 2021, which is good 8 to 10 months, right? So then your treasury bill rate was much higher, and your policy rates were even below. So that
Don't you think this treasury bill interest rates went up to 23% because no one was willing to buy?
Let me come to that, Shamir. Now, when you drop that your policy rate and PLR so much down, right? So when you allow that interest rate arbitrage, so there has to be a correction taking place. So that's the correction. Then all of a sudden, treasury bills started to go up.
Right.
So when it was 7, 8, so then it went to 11, but still your prime lending rate was much below that. So what the governor did, so he did that adjustment. So making it 14.5%. So then if banks want to go to central bank, ask for liquidity, now it is priced at 14.5.
Right. So Damit, now we are talking about the central bank to be independent because most of the international lenders now would ensure that politics is not involved in the culture of the central bank in Sri Lanka. However, the Monetary Board of Sri Lanka remains as it is. You have two members who are still sitting on the monetary board of the country who also advise the former governor of the central bank with regard to how the economy should move forward. Don't you think this itself is a problematic situation for the international lenders, as well as it sends a negative signal to the investors who want to come to the country?
Let me take it this way. The thing is that for international investors to come to this country, there has to be a confidence level being built up properly, and IMF program may be one. I heard the comments that were made. This IMF program will have 2-3 segments. One is that, correctly said, when you go to IMF, you don't get money. He doesn't come with the goodies, right? So there are 3 parts. You have the IMF program agreed, so then you have a bridging finance. Out of that, you have a debt restructuring plan. So if you want to bring that investor confidence, you need to work all 3 together, right? One doesn't, in isolation, doesn't help you to do it, right? So then, whilst the monetary board, that what you said, there are concerns that are floating around. How does the same people who advise when the economy goes down the road, and how can they advise the new governor as well, won't the same thing repeat? But before that, I think there are so many things which needs to come into be and put in place for us to see where this policies are taking the country.
Because Damit, at the end of the day, if it's going to be devoid of politics, the central bank should be totally independent to make sure that we come out of this mess by hook or by crook. That's very important.
I agree, Shamil.
So, Damit, I want to drag your attention to ratings, which one of the factors that the former governor of the central bank did not give any heed to. And we are in this mess today because of not listening to the rating agencies, which gave us the amber light and now the red light with regard to the country's economy. Now, Fitch Ratings has placed the national long-term ratings of 13 Sri Lankan banks on ratings watch negative, RWN, and they mentioned the 13 banks. Now, how scared must the people be of Sri Lanka to come and invest their money at these 13 local banks, which are the prime movers as far as the financial sector in Sri Lanka is concerned?
Good question. I think that's a pertinent question that requires good answer. So then people need to understand in a broader sense. If somebody comes and asks, can I deposit my money in X bank? It's a different question. But I think we need to look at this question in a much broader sense. So you said 13 banks put it on the rating watch. Why is that? Because even those are local banks. They are subject to the sovereign rating as well. When the sovereign defaulted, you can't have a better rating for a bank locally, much better than the sovereign which is rated. Number one. If you take one step back, how the banking and the financial system operated in this country, go back 10, 15, 20 years, the Sri Lanka has one of the most sophisticated supervisory framework.
We'll delve very technically about all this momentarily, but must the citizens of Sri Lanka be scared to come and put their savings now to these 13 banks in question?
I would say no, they should not. That's what I was trying to explain why it is. If you just say no, people need to figure out why we are saying no.
Yeah, we'll come to that, Damit, momentarily. So your answer is no. So you're telling us today that several years down the line, even if the country's economy has turned from worse to even worse, that the banks in Sri Lanka would not tell the saving account holders that we don't have money, and hence there is no alternative, but your money is with us, but we don't have money to give you. There won't be a situation like that, because currently, as I speak, countries like Iraq, countries like Libya, countries like Lebanon say this to their saving depositors. So that won't happen.
I don't see it is happening at the moment, but we need to see how the events unfold with IMF coming on board, whether it progresses. We have seen what happens in Pakistan very recently, right?
So are you saying there's a danger of that happening if we don't correct this problem soon?
So we need to correct this.
Right.
So we need to correct this.
Right. Thanks a lot, Damit Palwat, a senior banker. I now move to Jerome De Silva, veteran actor as well as a stage director. He is joining us via Zoom. Thank you very much, Jerome, for joining us this evening on Face the Nation. It's a pleasure to have you on board. You need no introduction with regard to the work that you've done to the community, to the theatre community at large in Sri Lanka. And let me get into the nuts and bolts of the question right away. Jerome, a few days ago, you were with a group of performing artists were at the Galle-Face Green. What were you all demanding from the government?
Yes, as Mr. Dhananath Fernando spoke about the fourth and fifth crises in this whole scenario, I mean, that's what affects the people, and that's what we were there for. Forget about the first, second, and third. Okay, those are things that caused the fourth and fifth crises in this whole fiasco which has become Sri Lanka. And it was those fourth and fifth crises that affect us as people, as normal people, as the future generation, as artists. And that is what we are fighting against. Right. I mean, today there was a huge cabinet reshuffle, but it is a reshuffling of the same pack of cards, which in our minds, as the nation, as the people of the nation, right, the nuts and bolts of this nation, this whole pack of cards, or this many reshuffling of all these cards, is only, it's a reshuffling of all black cards. There are no colored cards anymore. It's just all black. And everyone in the past, and as Dr. Nicholas spoke, over the last 70 years, from regime to regime, with a slight respite of President Premadas's era, which again was not continued after that, I mean, it has just been downhill. And whether it's reshuffled, whether someone else comes in, whether one is thrown out and the other one comes in, we're still facing the fourth and fifth crises as people. I mean, look at us, an agrarian society. Now, right, all egos put aside, people are retracting about this very almost what I could call a Hitler sort of idea of, this is good and we must do it this way, even though the repercussions we are facing it right now. All these policy decisions.
Jerome, today President Gotabaya Rajapaksa addressing the new set of individuals who were appointed to cabinet ranks as well as state ministers, the president goes on to say that he believes that Sri Lanka should have gone to the IMF programs much earlier, and he admits that not providing chemical fertilizer to farmers was a mistake, and that the government will provide chemical fertilizer once again. And then you saw several crossovers taking place as well. Two members of the SLFP joining hands with the government, one SJB parliamentarian, that is Dana Gamage, taking oaths as the state minister as well of transport. So you see a lot of things happening. As you correctly mentioned, the pack has been shuffled, but the jokers remain at the end of the day. But unfortunately or not, we are left with these set of people until an election is held. Are you satisfied in the way in which the president's remarks came today with regard to admitting his mistakes and moving forward now and taking accountability for the nation? Is that sufficient, or your cries are all about the president has to go home, there has to be a reform agenda, all 225 members need not be there because we can appoint individuals who are more brighter, who are more educated, who are more professional? What are your thoughts?
Well, actually, as I said, you can shuffle and reshuffle, and all the cards have become black now, because there was so much of knavery over the last so many decades, which has caused us this. And our whole protest there was like, okay, we may have, say, go home, this person go home, that person go home, the other person. But to get us out of this fourth and fifth crises, which the first three crises, as Mr. Dhananath Fernando spoke of, I mean, we have to get all that money that was siphoned out, illegally, as now we are talking about it. We knew at the back of our minds that this was happening. And now that's what we are saying. That's what all those thousands of people, Godface, are saying. If you listen to their slogans, they are not, of course, some of them are very insulting and that sort of thing. And probably those are the things that have caused this sudden change of policy, of almost egotistic rules, regulations, and as I said, very Hitler type of mentality. I think over the last 10 or 12 days, or maybe even more than that, I think finally they are listening to the people. And I mean, yesterday when the presidential secretariat was all lit up with all the slogans, so beautifully done. I mean, it has got home, I think. It has got home, and that's why today, after being so dogmatic and absolutely egotistical about certain decisions, including mainly affecting the agrarian society about chemical fertilizer. True, we were the granary of the East and all that in those days, and we never thought about chemical fertilizer, but it's true. I mean, you take decisions, good, those are good ideas, but you don't suddenly implement it after years and years and years and years of a different thing. It has to be a gradual process. And this was, I think, a lot of these very these ideas were good, but unfortunately they were sort of pushed down the people's throats when it should have been a gradual process. Right. And now, after, it's the people, even though the opposition or anyone in parliament may have said anything about all of this, it is the people coming out onto the streets from the time of the teachers and the education sector coming out talking about their anomalies. Then came this whole fertilizer problem, again where the farmers got out, and then came everything else. And then the fuel crisis, and then the electricity crisis, and now the drugs, the medicine and drugs crises. It is this that is brought out the people in unity.
Thank you very much, Jerome. Thanks a lot, Jerome, for your thoughts. From the frying pan into the fire, indeed. I want to open the floor for questions from our journalists. Onto my immediate right is this Al-Kabuge, and onto my immediate left is Nadeem Majid. Let's start off from this side.
Yes, thank you, Shamir. I'd like to direct my question to Dhananath, if I may. Now, we talk about this IMF relief package and how the IMF will offer assistance to Sri Lanka in debt restructuring and moving forward in improving the economy. But one thing that we expect from the IMF recommendations is a reduction in government expenditure. And that might extend to slashing of expenditure from ministries. And that might, correct me if I'm wrong, it might lead to slashing of employment as well. Now in Sri Lanka, now economic theories aside, like we see the human element playing a big part in the economy of Sri Lanka as well as the political sphere of Sri Lanka. And there'll be a lot of pushback from the people when they realize that they are losing subsidies and they're losing other benefits offered from the government. So and I believe economy also involves the human factor as well, and there are remedies and ways you can control it. So what is the best approach on enlightening the public and getting the public also on board for the future, which is going to be tough for us?
Rizal, definitely these reforms are going to be painful. We have to admit that. And it will definitely come to the public sector and public expenditure. And people are going to lose jobs because on the private sector on one front and also on the public sector on the other front. Because we have recruited too many people into the government service. We have about 1.5 million people in the government sector out of 8 million of our labor force, which is one of the highest in the world. And it's proven that our strategy hasn't been working. And most of these, lot of valuable state land and properties have been occupied. And if you look at our government cadre, it's more like tail heavy. it's a lot of no unrespect for the job role, but it's the staff and the work recruited by the politicians over a period of time by both, like every ruling party has caused this problem. And we can't really, from our revenue, we spent about 70% only on our interest of the previous debt, and another and including our debt servicing, it goes above 100%, and then you really don't have money to our essential services. So it will definitely come. And also the state-owned enterprises which are making colossal losses. For an example, Sri Lankan Airlines, which has again become like a controversial in the recent with their announcement, they are making losses almost equivalent to the Samurdhi allocation of poor people, which doesn't make any sense. And I don't think people will bear their losses at the expense of more taxes, because you have to first stop the leakage if you want to, fill your pot. So I think definitely, that's why I said this crisis, it's just the beginning. I am not trying to be negative.
But even if you look at it now, let's take a look at Sri Lankan Airlines. You said that Sri Lankan Airlines are making heavy losses, losses after losses. Let's take a look at the Ceylon Petroleum Corporation as well as the Ceylon Electricity Board, which are also the black sheep in the entire lot as far as losses are concerned. It's not that Sri Lanka can sell these to any foreigner to buy, or we can't do away with these institutions as well, can we?
There are options, Shamir. It will be difficult. I mean, with the liabilities, we can't just sell it and get some money. Most likely we have to pay them some amount to get rid of this. But rather than making losses every year of like 45 billion, 50 billion, and at some point there are 350 billion losses by Electricity Board and Petroleum Corporation, and 5 institutes make 384 million losses per day. So it's better to get rid of something, but I am not saying it's like, it's like a, all state-owned, we have to get rid of like all state-owned enterprises. Some we have to merge, some has to consolidate, some has to privatize, some has to go for a public-private partnership, but this will also take time.
Now the government is now looking at raising $8 billion US. The Sunday newspapers reported that they're looking at selling Kautunaik International Airport on a long-term lease of $2 billion US, Mattal Airport at $3 million US, Ratmalan Airport for $400 million US, the Colombo North Port Development Project $600 million US, the Colombo Port City lands to be leased at $4 billion US, Sri Lanka Telecom to be sold at $500 million US, as well as Sri Lanka Insurance Corporation shares to go at $300 million US. Now this culminates to $8 billion of our prime property in Sri Lanka, as well as institutes that are making good profits for the Sri Lankan economy as well as the state sector as a whole. Do you think this is the most prudent decision now?
Shamir, the consequences are, and the context is such, we have run out of options. And some of these, I am not sure about the valuation, it's reported as per the newspaper, so I can't assure on the numbers. But on some of those things we might have to do. But my starting point, if I were to recommend, starting with the loss-making ones, and at first stop the leakage, rather than first moving to the profit-making ones, because then there will be a lot of political pressure.
If you look at it, in the last few weeks or last few months, the government has been trying to even sell some of the prime lands in Sri Lanka. One of the examples are the Water's Edge was up for sale. The Colombo Grand Hyatt, which was put up during the Hapan regime, is also up for sale. But none of the investors came in to buy these properties. So we are in a dilemma, aren't we?
No, exactly, Shamir, because no investor will even look at Sri Lanka with the power crisis and with fuel shortages. Because even if I buy as a private investor, if you buy Water's Edge, how are you going to run the operation? Basically, you have to make further losses to keep it. So no investor will look at Sri Lanka at this point, and it would be a very difficult sale. I think that's probably why the government has to consider some of the profit-making ones to consider for privatization, because the times are really difficult, Shamir. We are talking about at the edge of a humanitarian crisis, because otherwise the pressure will again mount up on the political authorities, because the way it's moving, because already there are shortages of surgical items and the GMOA has spoken about it. So it will come, as I said, when the humanitarian crisis starts ticking in, the pressure will be difficult to control by any political party, and it can go completely out of control. So we have to stop before that. So exactly, so we are in a situation not making the right decision and not investing the borrowed money on dollar revenue generating assets is now we are paying off. The reason for this problem is we borrowed too much at short maturity at very high interest rate and invested in non-revenue generating assets.
Daranath, look at the joke. You know, the Hambantota port, which costed Sri Lanka to build at 1.2 billion US dollars, we sold at 1 billion US dollars. So that shows that even these assets that were up for sale were not getting the real amount of money, or else the Rajapaksa regime has siphoned off 200 million US dollars in the process. That's a different story altogether. But even to give away these assets, it's going to be a difficult situation, isn't it?
No, exactly. It will be very difficult, Shamir. And I think people also should realize the quantum of what this 1 billion means. One of the viewers has put a comment on our YouTube channel. What is the gravity of 1 billion rupees? So he has said, if a normal person saves 1,000 rupees every day, 1,000 rupees every day, that is 30,000 rupees a month, it will take 2,700 years to reach 1 billion. That means even if you start saving from the time when the Lord Buddha was born, you still have to save about another century to reach 1 billion. So if you are talking about $1 billion, that means you have to, at current exchange rate, that means you have to save about 300,000 every day for another century to reach out to 1 billion. And we are talking about, at our current debt, according to the news reports, we are defaulting about 51 billion US dollars. So we are talking about 51 times of that. And that's the gravity of this problem, and that's the gravity of our senseless investments. So we have to take it very seriously, and that's why I am also somewhat optimistic that we have to do the reform right if we are really need to come out of this crisis.
Dr. Nicholas, very interestingly, Vietnam can be brought in as an example, to a country that has done extremely well since 2012. After industrialization took place very rapidly in that country. Vietnam also went to the IMF for a helping hand. But Vietnam itself, because of policy decisions, they were able to come on top and reign supreme. And today Vietnam is one of the very countries that could be taken as an example as far as industrialization is concerned. How important is it for Sri Lanka to look at the Vietnam model now to see how we can come out on top as far as this economic mess is concerned?
I think it's very important, Shamir. But I want to preface this with some statistics that my son has been working on, and I've just had a presentation at the University of Colombo which I presented these statistics. It's this. So he has studied 162 countries. He has divided these countries into industrializing economies and non-industrializing economies. And he has just drawn two lines. And that is, two lines are the current account balances of these two clusters of countries. All the industrializing developing countries are all positive, plus 3% over the whole period of their industrializing development. So prior to industrialization, they were negative. But from the time they industrialized, they're all positive. All the non-industrializing countries, i.e. all the sub-Saharan African countries, most of the Latin American countries, South Asian countries, they all have negative current account balances. Why is this important is periodically, whenever there is a shock in the global system, all the non-industrializing countries go to the IMF. All the industrializing countries have no problem. They have plenty of reserves, and they're diversified manufacturing-based economies, like Vietnam. So in 2020 and 2021, when countries like Sri Lanka were suffering desperately, reserves plummeted, and we had cutbacks, Vietnam went in the opposite direction. Because they built their manufacturing base, what they did was they started producing home office equipment. Why? Because everyone in lockdown was starting home offices. And their reserves catapulted upwards. The currency became stronger against the US dollar. So the lesson was this, that they had a manufacturing base that allowed that resilience. As long as they were actually non-industrializing, so prior to 2012, you can see they had the same problem. So they went to the IMF, but going to the IMF didn't solve their problem. In fact, it made it worse. In 2020, they decided, okay, we've had enough. We're going to go down the China path, the other East Asian country path, Korea path, Japan path. And they went for it. And here's an interesting thing. I started teaching in 2012. As soon as I saw these policies starting, I get interested in countries. So when I saw China starting to industrialize, I started teaching in China. I want to learn. And the interesting thing was they asked me on a television program like this, except I didn't have these two learned gentlemen either side of me. I was just with one professor of economics. And they gave me a full hour on why industrialization is so important to a developing country.
Dr. Nicholas, taking a look at Vietnam, for an example, we know subsequent to the Vietnam War in 1975, the US heavily invested in Vietnam over the last few years, and in particularly from the 1990s to 2012 and so on and so forth. They say Rome was not built in a day. It took hundreds of years to build Rome. So in a situation like that, Sri Lanka was banking also on China, Russia, India for support. Do you think these countries have helped us enough over the last few years to raise our heads in terms after the end of the conflict in 2009?
No, I don't think we should look to anyone to help us. I think it starts with us. I think if you don't embark on an industrialization strategy, then whoever you're working with, whoever you borrow money from, they're going to exploit you.
Yeah, Dr. Nicholas, but if you look at industrialization, it needs the technical know-how. It needs the expertise. It needs the foreign direct investments to come in. So someone has to come and invest. It's easy to sit and say industrialization is the way forward for Sri Lanka. It's good on paper, but in reality it is not. Someone has to invest money in Sri Lanka. So who should we look at in terms of investments?
Well, what happened with Vietnam, I mean, it's a very good example. They didn't wait for the grand strategy. What they knew is they needed foreign technology. They needed to bring a manufacturer that was of some significance in the global system. And they needed to start immediately. So, as it happened, they were working with Korea, and Samsung came up. The company was given everything by the Vietnamese government. Literally, they sat at a table with Samsung and said, what do you need? And Samsung said, tax concessions, infrastructure, we need no import duties, we need no export duties, etc., etc. It went on and on and on like this. The Vietnamese said yes, yes, yes to everything. They didn't bargain. They simply wanted Samsung in their country and producing. And then what they did, which is very, very important, is they started setting up companies that were doing parallel things. So they started setting up their own smartphone companies. So they're learning from Samsung and adapting that technology and now starting to develop their own industries. They've now done it with several other multinational companies. So what they do is they just start. And gradually they build the infrastructure, they have the technical skills developing. But what they want is the technical know-how, which these multinationals are bringing, as well as the technology. And now you see Vietnam, I mean, just the end result is this. As of last year, the value of Vietnamese exports exceeded the total value of all Indian exports.
If you look at it, Dr. Nicholas, if Samsung came to Sri Lanka and spoke to our politicians would probably ask them, how much of money are you going to give me in order to make sure that the country's economy is cushioned? Because Sri Lanka is all about commissions and so on and so forth, so much of red tape.
Now, actually, it's very important that you say that, because many people think, oh, the difference is we have corrupt politicians, other countries don't. That's not true. That's not true. East Asian countries are run on the basis of corruption. Many people don't realize Japan is one of the most corrupt countries in the world. It's institutionalized corruption, but it's functional. And that's really important, because if you're dysfunctional, you're not rewarded in the Japanese system. But if you're functional, you're rewarded. So for all these East Asian countries, it's not that they're not corrupt and Sri Lanka is corrupt, but what are our politicians doing? What are our bureaucrats doing? And that is the big difference, because we are not going down that industrialization path, and that is where I see our biggest flaw.
So Dr. Nicholas, Dhananath was talking about not having investments that are reaping benefits for the country. Example, one of the projects, the Lotus Tower that was constructed by the Mahinda Rajapaksa regime. Maithripala Sirisena, the former president, went on to say there was so much of corruption behind this particular deal in question as well. And then he goes on to open that Lotus Tower in Sri Lanka. So politicians in Sri Lanka, of course, Dr. Nicholas knows how to make money and be on top of the game when it comes to any other country in question.
Also, Shamir, if I may ask Dr. Nicholas now, the fact that corruption exists, don't you think that kind of discourages investments and other businesses coming into a country?
No, actually corruption has never discouraged business. What discourages business is a lack of profits, a lack of productivity. This is fundamental. So, for example, when I did roadshows for investment companies, the investors only wanted me to answer one question. Is this a long-term profitable venture? They didn't ask me about corruption. They didn't ask me about budget balances. They didn't ask me about monetary policy. They wanted me to draw a picture for them of profits growth. And for me, profits growth, the company's export earnings in dollar terms. So I showed Sri Lanka having this export trajectory of dollars, and I overlaid it on East Asia. And I said, can you see the trajectory? And they saw it. And I can tell you that after the roadshow I did in 1992, I got a lot of investors for those two investment companies that I did it for.
But Dr. Nicholas, you have to admit, though, that corruption does sort of encourage rent-seeking businesses and cronyism.
Absolutely.
And that discourages investment.
Absolutely, but here's the difference. So in sub-Saharan Africa, the only way business groups actually can make money is by getting their cronies in power, because they have no dynamism. But in countries with dynamism, that's not so important. But when you have no dynamism, that's why the corruption actually kills the whole society. And you can see it all over sub-Saharan Africa.
So you're saying that Sri Lanka also lacks dynamism?
Absolutely. And then the corruption really is so destructive for the system, because actually it's exactly what you said, it's rent-seeking. then the only way the business groups can actually make any money is by getting their politicians in power. So it's this constant battle between different business groups to get their politicians in power. And once those politicians come into power, the way in which money is made is actually sucking up to the politicians. That is destructive.
Daminta, how would you rate the current, like from your perspective, the current health of the banking sector in the country? Because people are worried about their savings, their fixed deposits, their loans that they've taken. People are worried about, are our banks going to collapse?
So I would say banking sector is stressed. Nothing at this point you can't say, it's not stressed. So when you say the banking sector is stressed, there are 3-4 areas which the banking sector getting stressed. One is the exchange. So you don't have foreign exchange the way that you want, in amounts that you want, to support probably the essential imports, other facilities which are essential for the country to run. So then that creates a pressure both ways. And then we have a rising interest rates. People who borrowed when the interest rates were 7, 8, 6, 9, now the interest rate will increase to 20%, 20 plus. How are they going to service those facilities when the interest rates go up? Hardly any business in this country generate 20%, 25% profits to service interest. So how are they going to service? So then that is going to lead to creating bad assets. So the bad assets, what does it do to the banking sector? It requires more and more impairment. So that will take the profits out of the system. So what does that happen? It eats into the capitals. Where earlier, when we make the profits, it will go to the capital, and that helps to grow the loan book and the businesses next year and year on. So now it is kind of curtailed. And on top of all that, so business revival part after a kind of a pandemic, it just beginning to see some results, but all of a sudden with the crisis hitting in so many ways, now we are seeing businesses started to kind of feeling that heat. So meaning, after coming out of the moratorium, if you start from the Easter attacks in 2019 April, the tourism sector was in moratorium. It just about to come out in June this year. With the pandemic starting, so we started giving moratoriums for March 2020 for all other SMEs and the businesses. They came out in December. When they just started to roll the business out, so they have revived, maybe they're operating 40%, 50%, hardly anybody, came back to 100%. Now, once again, they are finding it difficult, no raw materials, because a lot of industries in this country, depending on the imported raw materials. If you don't have dollars to import, they get, in between they get stuck. And even if you get the raw materials, you have electricity issues, power cuts to continue production. You can't, continue supply chains because you don't have fuel. You can't take stock from one place to another. So what all these things do are that kind of curtail the real economy production. And I heard they're talking about exports. Last year, everybody was happy and rejoicing. Our imports hit 12 billion or something more than that. Earlier, we used to have a $16, $17 billion imports and 10 billion exports.
The problem is our exports aren't really increasing as a percentage of GDP.
That's
Even
true.
though, like the president also
But on the other
said,
hand,
we are hitting these numbers of exports, but as a percentage of GDP, it's not really improving.
That's one aspect. The other aspect is when your exports go up from, say, $10 billion to about 12.5, your imports have gone up from 16, 17 billion to $22 billion. So you have widened the gap. So then that's why it is important we have that strategy. How do we grow the industrialization of exports if we want to permanently come out of this? So whatever that we do interim should use as a platform. So that will help. So coming back to
where is the blockage? What is preventing industrialization? Because we've seen the examples that Dr. Nicholas gave in with Vietnam. Even with South Korea, we've seen how they sort of Taiwan, you know, countries that kind of gotten into manufacturing very complex products, things like your microchips. What is it that is stopping Sri Lanka from getting into that? Because I mean, we're not going to get out of this crisis by continuing to sell coconuts. We need to be doing more, far more complex stuff.
Absolutely.
What is actually stopping us from doing that?
So when we speak to so many investors, there is one thing getting highlighted over and over again. So when somebody needs to come to a country, they need some consistency in the policies. We don't see that. You know, year by year, maybe sometimes with retrospective effect, we have seen the policies have been changing. But the investor to come and establish and do a long-term investment, they at least need some kind of stability or consistency in the policies. Obviously, they look at the profits. Yes, that's their motive to come in. But how do we facilitate that? So that has become one of the key pain points in this country for UAE to attract investors.
Dr. Nicholas, when talking about these blockages, like we've seen, I mean, we know that there are institutions like Slintech, for example, that they do some kind of innovation, some kind of R&D, but in a broader sense in Sri Lanka, you don't really see that happening. And like efforts to open up sectors, I'm sure Shamir can testify to this, take tea, for example. There's a country in Asia that is famous for tea and cricket, and it's not Sri Lanka, it's Dubai. Right? So efforts to like open up the tea sector, to, you know, get us access to bigger markets, because you can't grow if you're only going to be selling to the 20 million people that are in your country. And if that is what the market that you're confining yourself to, then woe to you. What is it, because you mentioned that, you know, the last time you'd seen that kind of policy direction from a Sri Lankan administration was Premadasa Senior in the late 80s, early 90s, and that the results of that only came later. What exactly were those decisions, and why is it that those things haven't been done since then? In the 20 plus years since then, why is it that it has not been done?
Well, what I observed during President Premadasa's time, at that time I'd just set up the Institute of Policy Studies, so I had a bird's eye view of what was going on in policy. And one thing that I realized was, if you wanted to make money, you had to be in exports. If you wanted to just survive, you could be producing for the domestic market. But he got his policymakers to change all the incentives. So we had the development banks giving 20-year loans at 4%. And we had tax exemptions. We had, so even on those loans, you had the first 5 years, no capital repayments, etc., etc. On taxes, we had income tax exemptions. We had rebates on tariffs, etc., etc. He used to have a session at the Export Development Board every 2 weeks with line ministers. And he would get a series of complaints from business people, and he would ask each line minister who was responsible, deal with it. I want the answer in 2 weeks, you know, at the next meeting. And basically, Sri Lanka, as one ship, was headed as an export vehicle. So everything was geared towards exports. And that's what you saw. You saw this dynamism really starting. It encouraged diversification. I've repeated this many times because I'm still offended by it, that I was thrown off a plane at least twice because it was overbooked. And it was overbooked by business people coming to Sri Lanka, setting up, because we had announced to the world, we're open for business. Anyone that wants to get into manufacturing exports, come to Sri Lanka because you're going to make lots of profits. And we did see the diversification starting. But as soon as he was assassinated, that stopped. And I think that's where I personally identified a lot of foreign pressure. And that coupled with, let's say, there's an inherent trader mentality in the business community in Sri Lanka. He ruptured that, but he never got rid of it. And so today you still have this composite of, on the one side, a lot of foreign pressure, which is blocking us. And remember, we're not the only ones. I was telling someone just before we started this that I have this incredibly popular video. It's on social media all over sub-Saharan Africa. You know, some people tell me it has as many as 10 million hits. It's just a half-hour presentation I make as to why sub-Saharan Africa is impoverished. And it's the blocking of industrialization. And I have case study after case study after case study. Where did I get it from? I got it from all my sub-Saharan African students over 30 years. They gave me so many case studies, and I said to them, oh, wait a minute, this is very much like Sri Lanka. You know, and there, the policymakers understand what's happening.
Dharanath, I'll pose this question to you as well. You might have a slightly different take on what is blocking the push towards industrialization, because I think you all agree that we do need to, we can't be this sort of service-oriented economy. We do need to have manufacturing, but where is that blockage?
Nadeem, I think the industrialization is all good. I think the industrialization should take place on a market-based system. The state can't handpick, okay, you should do this, you should do tea, you should do rubber. It's like I'm coming to Shamir and say which flavor of tea to be sold. I'm not the expert. Shamir knows it much better than I do. And I have a chart, interestingly, since you mentioned about the imports and exports, I hope you can get this. So you can see as a percentage of GDP since 1990s, our imports and exports both are declining as a percentage of GDP. So the reason for this is why our industrialization is not taking place. So as you can see, from 1990s to 30%, our exports have declined to 16.6%. And our imports, even from about 40%, it has declined to 22%. So the reason for this is, Nadeem, our imports are not competitive because we have been protecting through tariff. And this has a concern also with the civil war, or like the terrorist war we had, because most of the war, war expenditure was financed by high tariff rates. And I have few numbers to show you. From 2004 to 2009, our total nominal protection was doubled from 13% to 27.9%. That means someone like Shamir, who is running an export business, he has to bear the inefficiency of whoever who is protecting the imports. For an example, it could be his fuel. The state-led companies, the inefficiency has to be paid by Shamir. That is making Shamir's tea exports uncompetitive in the global market. And from 2000 to 2015, the total effective protectionism increased from 47% to 63%. So as a result, all exporters have to bear that inefficiency in their balance sheet. For an example, on our construction, our floor tiles, wall tiles are protected by 107%. Our steel protected by about 80%. Our cement is protected at the same rate. So that means people like Shamir and the export who are building their construction factories, they have to incur almost double the cost on their manufacturing. That has to be covered on their pricing. That has to be compete at the global markets. So that's the problem in terms of protectionism. And I'll come on also on these tax reliefs. So in 2008, there was an act called Strategic Development Act. So under that act, the minister has the authority to give tax breaks if the project is on a national interest. But this national interest is loosely worded. So as a result, if I am the minister, if Shamir comes, I can give you a tax break. And that also led to a massive corruption because I am the decision maker and I can of course have a chat with Shamir and discuss something else. So as a result, actually our BOI companies, the numbers dropped from 2005 from 1,150 to 855 in 2015. So that protectionism is one reason why our exports are not growing, and we have to incur a massive cost on construction and so many other imports. And in terms of our import bill, 80% is intermediate goods and capital goods. It's only 20% we are importing as consumable goods. And I am completely against basically when the state start picking people which industry to be good, that causes corruption. And since we talked about the South Korea, I am going to quote Mr. Park, General Park, who was considered the father of this South Korean miracle. He said,
was also a brutal dictator.
Exactly, but he was considered to be the person who really in the mid 1960s who really converted the Korean economy for an export-led economy. This is what he said: the economic planning or long-range development program must not be allowed to stifle creativity or spontaneity of private enterprises. We should utilize to the maximum extent the merit usually introduced by the price mechanism of the free competition, thus avoiding the possible damages accompanying a monopoly system. There can be and will be no economic planning for the sake of planning itself. Now this is the words of the person who really transformed the Korean economy. And we'll talk about Japan as well. In the Japan, especially we all know Japan is known for Toyota cars. When Mr. Toyota was proposing that he want to make cars, this Japan has this MITI, which is the Japanese Ministry of Trade and Industry. They recommended to Mr. Toyota not to manufacture cars because they said it won't work. But he ignored their advice and recommendation, and he started making cars, and the rest is history. So every time when the states start picking up the winners, it is the problem. And what happened in Sri Lanka is the massive protectionism, and that is causing a lot of pressure on the consumers, the business community, and that's what led to where we are. And in terms of, there were good stories like what happened in Vietnam. Actually, Vietnam boom also came in 2016 with the Intel Corporation coming in, but Sri Lanka had a good opportunity, but we missed that. The Motorola and the Harris company came to Sri Lanka to set up a factory of about 2,600 employment. But because of the riots during that time, I think it's 1987-88 period, those two companies left to Penang, and now they are performing. So we also had very unfortunate incidents, but it's the protectionism that stopped our industrialization, and the private sector led market-based industrialization is what we require, because that allows the creativity of the private sector for us to really grow and to take our economy to the next level. But we are talking about a crisis situation.
But Dhananath, even if you look at the private sector in Sri Lanka, some of the companies are acting very selfishly. Now, the country's tea industry can be liberalized. As a result, we can export to many countries. We can look at that as an option. And today, countries which are going to India, which are going to Indonesia, which are going to China for tea, can come to Sri Lanka and buy the same tea with a value-added component added to it. But because of the selfish nature of some of the companies in Sri Lanka, the government has not been able to even liberalize the tea industry in the country. So there are selfish agendas of private sector, some of the private sector companies in Sri Lanka as well, who are only looking at their interest as a whole.
No, exactly, Shamir. I think I saw Professor Nicholas has made the same comment, that the private sector is also, I think, in my humble opinion, is responsible for this crisis, because we have always looked at some of the companies on their self-interest. It's fine, or everyone is looking for profits, and we also have to maximize profits. But when you do that profit maximization at the expense of hampering the competition and hampering of like having a equally level playing field, those problems is going to come. And
these companies, some of the companies that I'm talking about, I don't want to mention names, they don't have operations in Sri Lanka, but they have operations in other countries where they park their money in outside accounts, unfortunately. So that is the situation that Sri Lanka is also facing. I want to move to Damit Palwat, senior banker, joining us this evening on Face the Nation for the first time. Damit, inconsistent policy is one of the red lights for any investor in Sri Lanka. Now, you spoke about 2019, 2020, 2021, many companies were finding it very difficult to make some money, make some profits. But this government announced last year in the budget that a tax surcharge would be slapped on companies who are making over 2 billion in profits, which came up to approximately around 25%, if I'm not mistaken. This is on top of the 24% they're already paying the government in tax. That puts the full figure at 49% of taxes to be paid on their profits if they hit 2 billion or more. How has this affected the business community at large in Sri Lanka?
So this 25% surcharge, Amir, is affecting badly, especially on the financial institutions. So there are a group of companies who are making the highest percentage of taxes. If you add this 25% on top of what they're already paying, probably about 70-75% of the earning is tax. So that in turn give certain effects which adversely impact into the future. When you take out your profits, if you don't pay that surcharge, you take your profits and give part to your shareholders as dividends and keep part invested within the company for the growth. If you don't have that capital, because raising capital in this country is very expensive. And now, if you look at, given the circumstances, you can't, work out raising capital quite easily. Even rights issue is kind of finding it difficult at this moment of time. So when you take that money out as a tax payment, so that we are taking the capital which is infused back into the company for this to support growth. So that is one. So if you take it out from the financial institutions and to the others, right, it impacts the same way. So the borrowing has become expensive, raising capital has become expensive. So from where are they going to find capital to grow the business? So this kind of one-off taxes are creating effect multiple years. Though it is one-off in collecting the tax, you create impact over multiple years.
Right. So Damit, now we are saying that taxes have to increase at the end of the day, because if not, we can't sustain the country's economy. Given that fact, how can you source these funds without bringing in a taxation of this sort? How can you bring forth money to the country's economy?
Very good question. Now, the taxing doesn't mean you go and bring one-off taxes, identifying a threshold above that, and it is post facto identifying this is the kind of profit margin that we are going to set that tax surcharge tax on. So there are two things. You need to broaden your tax base, number one. Then the way that the tax applied you need to change, or for that matter reviewed. So when those two are being done together with optimizing your expenditure, I think that's where you optimize your revenue. If you look at only one side, making the tax more and more taxes on a particular threshold or particular industry or particular sector, I think it's going to adversely impact rather than broadening the tax base.
So Daranath, let's look at what sort of prescriptions that are going to come from the IMF. You said that we need to have a reform agenda. When we're going to the IMF, we have to have a reform agenda. Has this agenda been communicated to the people? Because the people don't know what's going on. You had the Minister of Finance going to Washington, you had the new governor going to Washington, then you had the Secretary to the Minister of Treasury going to Washington. No problem at all with that. They have to travel to make sure that they have concrete discussions. But what is the reform agenda they are going to present to the IMF?
Shamir, at the moment, we don't know the reform agenda. The worst case could be not having a reform agenda. So for the fairness of the finance minister, I think he was just appointed 1 or 2 weeks ago, so he really may not have time to do an reform plan. But I think there are enough material that think tanks like us, intellectuals, have put a framework for reform agenda. So I think that has to be taken forward, or consider those ideas. But definitely IMF is going to put forward in their Article 4 report, they have mainly recommended 5 main reforms. One is for vulnerable community, a cash transfer system. Second, a pricing mechanism for fuel and electricity and all energy. And they have also recommended a revenue-based fiscal consolidation, meaning to increase taxes and cut down the government expenditure. And also they have recommended to have proper trade mechanism, because it is also violating, if I remember right, their Article 7, because you can't really restrict imports for a longer period of time. It's we can't have that under the articles that we have agreed with. So likewise they have given, and also cutting down the government expenditure on unnecessary expenditure has to be cut down. Those reforms have been given. So I think their program will come with those 5. But Shamir, what we have to keep in mind is what India did in 1991. They were in a similar crisis. Montek Singh Ahluwalia and Manmohan Singh went with their plan. And they said, this is the reform plan that we want to do. You guys support. So as a result, the IMF... They got a good deal. They got a good deal. And the IMF program is they will measure quantitatively and give us money in tranches. So we have to have a program, okay, we do this. So at that point we'll get this tranche, and I think there are about 6 reviews that they do when they are giving money. So my view is there are sums we can do even before going to the IMF, and we have to front load the hard reforms at the beginning, so then we can do it immediately. But
Dhananath, do we have the likes of individuals like Dr. Manmohan Singh in Sri Lanka? Because he was a hardcore economist who wanted to steer the country's economy in the right trajectory. But do we have the technical know-how of individuals of that caliber to steer the country's economy? Can we bank on these 3 individuals thinking, this is it, we only have them, we have to stick with them?
I hope there will be a hero will be born, Shamir, but I think with
but
all
do you
due
see
credit
that hero? Do you see that hero in Sri Lanka at present?
No, I think the appointments have done with. I don't want to give any endorsements or a character certificate to any individuals, but I think the central bank governor is very well experienced. He has been negotiated with IMF. He knows the problem, so I hope that he will have a better detailed plan, and so as the...
Well, let's not forget...
But the problem is that we're looking for heroes.
We are looking for heroes.
But let's not forget the most controversial Greek bonds that took place. Even at that time, the deputy governor of the central bank was Dr. Nandalal Veerasinghe. We shouldn't forget that.
Yeah, so I'm exactly, Shamir. I'm not going
to... We shouldn't forget the past as well. Now we are looking at hero at the moment, and we are saying that the current governor can steer the country's economy in the right trajectory, but we shouldn't forget the past, what has happened as well.
No, definitely, Shamir. That's why I said I don't want to give any character certificate or comment on any individuals, but I think there are enough programs put forward, Shamir, on what needs to be done. So at least it's a matter of collating those ideas and do like in a form. So Advocata has done one. I think all the other main think tanks and people like Mr. Chandra Jayaratna, they all have contributed. So I think it's a matter of collating that plan and taking it forward. And I'm optimistic that this reform plan will be taken forward and do the necessary reforms to overcome this situation.
Dr. Nicholas, you seem to be a little bit pessimistic going to the IMF. In your opening remarks, you said this is not where the buck has to stop. We have to look at the future, what's going to happen in the next 10 to 20 years. Why are you pessimistic about going to the IMF?
Well, it's like when this government came into power, I read their manifesto before they came into power, and that was splattered with industrialization, export-oriented industrialization. In other words, like many other governments before, they knew what they had to do. But they come into power and they've abandoned it. So when I now see the reform proposals that the IMF is supposed to be encouraging Sri Lanka to take, I don't see any long-term prospects for Sri Lanka. I think what you're likely to see is Sri Lanka will be encouraged to go to the international capital markets. They'll get some money from the IMF, but the balance is going to come from the international capital markets, which will then indebt Sri Lanka further and make servicing even more difficult without any prospect of export-oriented industrialization. So the day I actually see a proper plan with export-oriented industrialization as the core, and then these other reforms put into place, because we know that there should be tax reforms, we know there should be monetary reforms, not the Monetary Act, incidentally. I'm totally against that. But the various reforms which are definitely necessary, but cast in stone on the basis of an export-oriented manufacturing strategy.
So we're talking about productivity, Dr. Nicholas. One of our viewers are posing a question to you. In the interest of productivity, whether the government will have the guts to take out the poor holiday?
I can't comment on things like that. Samir, you want to get me into trouble, isn't it?
I'm trying my best not to. But in terms of productivity, Dr. Nicholas, I think the viewer is asking a very fair question. We have so much of holidays in Sri Lanka. Would the government have the guts to take off these holidays that are draining the private sector as well?
Well, my starting point is when President Premadasa started this 200 garments factory project, there wasn't a prior reform of the holidays. Yet we had this fantastic growth rate over that period from 1991 to 1994. Sri Lanka's economy grew, I think, on average 6.5 to 7%. Now, we didn't have the reform of the holidays, etc. And it also belied this idea that Sri Lankans are lazy. My standard line is, if you provide the incentive structure for Sri Lankan entrepreneurs, they will accept it. There, Dhananath, I wanted to come back to what he said. I think it's very important that we have to abandon this import substitution strategy, which has always been there underlying all industrialization discussions. No, it is export-oriented industrialization. When you mix it with import substituting industrialization, actually you negate the incentives for the exporters. I take your point there, and it's a very important point. But once you create that incentive structure, you will see all sectors of society responding. The problem is we've never created that incentive structure. But the day you do that, and that's why I think President Premadasa's experiment was so important, because it belied this fact that Sri Lankans are lotus eaters.
Dr. Nicholas, if I may ask you a question now, I'd like to know your opinion on one of the recommendations forwarded by the IMF. It's regarding the Colombo port city. Now, they've recommended that we've given tax concessions, and previously you explained how that is important in order to bring investors and encourage them to invest in the country and become productive in the country. Now, we've given tax concessions on Port City, and also the IMF have requested that we shield the domestic financial activity from offshore banking activity. Now, in your opinion, what is your critique on it? Is it a justifiable thing to be proposed by the IMF? How should we go about it?
Well, I think, let me start with Port City. I think this offers a great opportunity to bypass a lot of red tape if you're going down that export-oriented manufacturing route. And I think that opportunity has to be taken. If it's not taken, then Port City becomes essentially a money laundering possibility. So that would be my main conclusion about Port City. If you don't take this opportunity and use it to bypass all the red tape, where you can get companies registering in Port City and enjoying all those tax benefits, but the quid pro quo is they actually have to start manufacturing in Sri Lanka. That for me is the quid pro quo.
Damit, interestingly, now how much of money does the private sector in Sri Lanka have in USD terms?
Very difficult question, Shamir. I don't think I have the number at the moment with me to tell you what kind of dollar. That means with the private sector dollar reserves that you asked.
Absolutely.
So I don't have that number, Shamir, at the moment to tell you.
Because right now when we look at it, Damit, the situation looks very bleak. You go to the Bank of Ceylon or the People's Bank, which are the two state banks, which hold a lot of foreign reserves at the moment, because most of the private sector companies also go to these two banks thinking they are heavily guarded, and it's very easy to work with those two state banks also. Right now, if you go to them, they say they don't have the money. So where is the money disappearing?
There are few things, Shamar. I think it's important that what has happened over the last probably 12 to 15 months. Now the country's fuel bill, fuel plus gas, is coming to about $400 million, right?
It's approximately $500 million US.
400 to 500 in between, right? So that needs generally get funded between two state banks. Then number two, the country used to get from the banking channels about 600 to 650 million remittances. That dried up. Now it is around 200.
Thanks to the former governor of the central bank, Ajit Kumar Kabra.
200 to 225 million.
I mean, don't be scared.
Right?
Yeah.
So then exporters, when the dollar was fixed, there were so many businesses who were established offices outside, and they managed to transact from there, which is obviously a possibility. A lot of companies do that, right? Because we need to create that export, for that export-oriented companies, incentive to bring the dollars in. So first we had a incompatibility with bringing remittance money in because of the rate, and then exporters came into that, which built a market outside the formal banking channels. So once you get used to it, it's very difficult for people to get back to the formal banking channels. That's what we experience at the moment. So I heard the conversation about the port city. Port City is trying to do something to incentivize those dollars to be sent through Port City to the local banking accounts, incentivizing kind of a duty-free allowance. Those are good strategies, so then people can route their dollars through. But what really happens to dollars, it's not that remittance money is not coming to the country. Those are coming. We need to have a plan. How can we bring them through the formal channels? Exporters, we need to have that incentive for them to bring back money through the formal channels and kind of getting converted. At the moment we see whatever the money we get, they bring back to the country most of the time just enough to service their loans and advances, or just to meet their expenses. We need to have some mechanism where we encourage them to bring the complete portion of dollars into the country, that's where the country get benefited.
No, because you spoke about the port city, Damit. I recollect when the port city bill was then tabled in Parliament by Minister of Justice, then now the Minister of Finance, Ali Sabri. He said that approximately $25 billion US would be attracted through port city, and now we are looking at selling the port city for $4 billion US. So I don't know how logical that argument is, but where is all this money? Now they said that $1.5 billion will come when they put up the structures. Who gulped all this money? Politicians.
But I think Port City, the structures have not come up yet. I think there were I saw few articles that they have published saying they are trying to start something virtually until the physical infrastructure comes up. It's a good suggestion actually. Good suggestion for the time being, at least to get some of those remittances and export proceeds coming through them with an incentive for them to allow something to get additional. So which makes, there are double benefits. Sometimes, it helps to make our exports price competitive in the market. At the moment, because of the cost associated in the export production process, sometimes we find it, our products are uncompetitively priced. So that helps. And the second thing is that it promotes the remittances which are coming outside the entire formal banking channels to be routed through them. So then that increases the kind of money comes into the country through formal channels.
Dharanath, if I may ask you a small question. Now, Minister Ali Sabri, he spoke to Reuters a few days ago, and one of the things that was apparent in what he said was that they are expecting 3 to 4 billion from the IMF. And from what he had told them, it looks to me or the public that they are targeting that money towards importing essential items. Now, we know that we got a 1 billion credit line from India, and also China supported us, but that runs out in weeks sometimes. So it seems that they are going for a monthly plan, like maybe to survive the next 6 months. So in your learned opinion, where do you think this money should be injected to get the best out of it from the IMF?
First, Nizal, if I were to advise the finance minister, if I were the finance minister, I won't put the numbers forward. I would say it's like going to the bank. I say I have a project, I want your support, the finances, and these are the numbers. This is how it looks like. But when I say like I want a loan of 4 billion rupees, and then they think like, okay, you are going to bring this proposal which will fill the 4 billion gap. I think I'll first put the reform plan. Okay, look, I'm going to reform this. I'm going to set it, make sure that even after the restructuring, I'm going to make sure that all our creditors can be paid with a dynamic economy. And to do that, I can't let my industries die. I need a bridge financing of this amount. For that, I would expect these reforms to be done. IMF support, I am expecting from the IMF this amount. I'm going to tap World Bank, I'm going to tap China, India. That's the plan that I would come with. Answering your question, so these money definitely has to injected on essential items. It's basically
Dharanath, with a learned opinion, now you've seen the way in which how the political circus has been happening in Sri Lanka over the last few years. You are very much involved. You also at one point advised the former Minister of Finance who backbenchers of the parliament said has 7 brains. I don't know where those 7 brains went in terms of resurrecting the country's economy. But looking at all this, now it seems to me with what you're saying and answering the question to Disal, that even Minister Ali Sabri is a little bit immature in his role as the Minister of Finance. His background is on law and so on and so forth. Given that fact, if you look at the numbers in Parliament, the 225 members, who is that hero that you're talking about? Is there any hero in this 225?
Shamir, definitely I can't mention any names.
No, is there any hero? Forget about mentioning names, because we had the man with 7 brains, 7 heads. We had a lot of gods. We had people who spoke about Port City at one point. The former Minister of State Minister Cabral said that Port City would add around $4.5 billion to the gross domestic product of the country in the first few years, and thereafter at a rate of around 12 billion of additional GDP. This would make a vast difference to our 80 billion GDP country. Now, all these are very well articulated, and at one point the former governor of the central bank even had a magic wand in his hand to give subsidies to the people, and that is why we are in this crisis at the moment. But forget about all that. Do you see a hero in this 225?
No, I think there are few people, I don't want to mention names, but I think there are people who have studied and on all political parties. But even I think the Minister Sabri, though he is coming from a legal background, he can understand, but I think he lacks experience because it's the first time and he resigned. I think he was not very well prepared to take up that portfolio, because that's why before, in my view, 24 hours he resigned. But also it's a part of the political crisis, because you are really worried about, you really don't know what's happening, and also the general economic theory won't apply in a crisis, because it's everyone, because people are holding dollars, it's not converting, and interest rates are very high. It's all chaos, Shamir. So I think there are a few people, but it's a very challenging time, obviously. But my view is, we have to be, again, the IMF program, we have to put first the what are we planning to do, and then it's easy to convince them on the money that we are going to get, but it has to be injected on the essentials. There's no other place to inject the money.
But look at the statement, Dharanath. Now, I don't understand this government. Please tell me this is the way forward for Sri Lanka. Now, they go to the World Bank requesting $700 million to buy chemical fertilizer to the country. And then on the other hand, they are saying that they are going to give it at a subsidized price. Prime Minister said this a couple of days ago when he addressed the nation. Today the President is saying that the subsidy would be given back again to the farmers. Where are they going to find this money now? Do you think the World Bank will come and give fertilizer to Sri Lanka when we are almost in the verge of a foreign debt crisis, to be given at the subsidized prices?
No, I don't think actually the World Bank will give at subsidized prices, though those statements has to be basically reconsidered.
So it's okay for me to think that the government is not on the right track, and it's not the journalists or the other people.
So basically we have to give I think the fertilizer supply has to be ensured, but I don't think we can afford to have it at a subsidized price, and especially the World Bank, I'm doubtful on that. But Shamir, I think it's the matter is, I understand there's inconsistencies in policies, and that's what we are paying
for. Why are they making the mistake over and over again, Dharana? That's my question. They learn a lesson, now they're doing the same mistake again.
Yes, so just to answering your question on your previous comment, whether I advised the previous finance minister, it was not advised. Exactly, we were invited to give suggestions to save 150 billion of expenditure and increase the revenue by 150 billion.
But he didn't listen, no, Dharana. That also you didn't.
Yeah, so we gave our suggestions. He was in agreement with most of the suggestions, but I think implementation wise there were constraints.
Always problem in Sri Lanka, no, Dharana.
Yes.
Once I met Charita Herath from the previous regime, and I asked him a question about what's the problem in Sri Lanka. Then he said, first is implementation, second is implementation, third is also implementation.
I think which reflects exactly. I agree with you, but unfortunately, Samir, for your tough questions, I can't take a position.
Dharanath, if I may ask you this question.
No worries. But you don't have to worry now.
No, I'm not worried.
There are people on the streets asking the government to go home, so you don't have to worry coming and telling something.
I'm not worried, but yes.
Yeah. So
as a youngster in Sri Lanka, you still have the potential.
No, I am not worried, but in answering and giving.
No, don't worry.
I'm
well respected. Dr. Nicholas, now you've seen the political circus in Sri Lanka for some time. You've been in the country, you've been an associate professor at International Institute of Social Studies for some time, so you know exactly what's going on. Politically, Dr. Nicholas, if you were to advise the present government, what would that advice be?
Well, first I have to correct you. I don't know what's going on.
You don't know what's going on?
I mean, we've been discussing here, none of us knows what's going on in actual fact.
Right.
But I just repeat like a broken record. Stick to the fundamentals, which we all know work. We have so many lessons from all over the world over the last 40, 50 years, and embark on this strategy. And there, I'm not worried about the niceties of getting budget deficits down and monetary policy tightened and things like that. I'd rather start with the most fundamental and give that message to the business community, so that the business community knows there's continuity. Now, going back to what Dhananath said, one of the things why I blame the business community is in Sri Lanka you have a democratic system and governments are going to change. And with every government there's likely to be pressures to deviate. The continuity is the business community and the professional strata. If they can just unite and adopt this long-term strategy and say to whatever government, whatever political shade, look, if you want to survive, you have to continue with this policy. Why do you think Germany has virtually no difference between Christian Democrats and Social Democrats? When the governments change, no one even notices, because the business community imposes on them one long-term strategy. And it's been a very long-term strategy, their export-oriented industrialization. And this cannot be touched. This is not negotiable from the business community. The same with the Dutch. The same with the Japanese. So, in democratic systems, the continuity is not with government. You cannot expect them, because they're under so many pressures and different forces. But what I see with the Sri Lankan business community is that there's this culture of following the government for contracts. You know, without imposing on the government, okay, in general terms, this is what we need, and this is what we want. Even now, this is a perfect opportunity. The population doesn't trust any politician at all. This is the opportunity for the professional classes and the business community to get together and come up with broad parameters of a strategy and impose it on whoever comes to power. And then have that as a continuity, you know, where they do more research and develop that program over the longer period, because, you know, our experience with the politicians is that they actually cannot take us forward.
Dr. Nicholas, and also I'd like Dhananath and Mr. Namit to also contribute to this. Now, Dhananath previously mentioned that we've gone to the IMF 16 times, and only a few number of times we've actually implemented their programs. And also, if you look at Pakistan and other countries, they've failed to implement reforms by the IMF. Now, we've seen our government continuously failing to uphold what they stand for and what they agreed to do. So how can we be sure that they will implement the reforms by the IMF? And also, to quote Dhananath on one of our previous programs, the focal point, you said the IMF is sometimes lenient in regulating and enforcing these programs. So how can we make sure from a government level, from a civil level, and also the international level, that these reforms and these programs will be adhered to?
If you're asking me, I wouldn't adhere to them. I don't think these are correct programs. You know, what I think Sri Lanka has to do is to adopt its own longer-term strategy. In this situation, of course, we're now in a particularly desperate situation. So, you know, we may have to bite the bullet and do some of what the IMF requires us to tide us over. But I think that the only way out of this, I mean, I don't know any country, any East Asian country, with the IMF's help, that actually went down the industrialization path.
Why do I get the feeling? You sound a bit like the former governor in terms of his way forward. Am I right in that analogy? Or
no, because the thing that I've been critical of this government for a very long time is that they don't have this industrialization strategy. I mean, being against the IMF just because they're the IMF is absurd. You know, I mean, what's the point of being against the IMF if you don't have an industrialization strategy? Then what I've recommended is go with the IMF, implement whatever they want you to implement. Because actually you don't have any alternative anyway. But if you have an alternative, if you have an export-oriented development strategy, then the IMF is not going to help you. You know, I think you have to then try manage to get as many bilateral funds as you possibly can. And if now they've cut those bridges, they're left with the IMF.
Daranath, do you agree with Dr. Howard Nicholas's thoughts?
How I see it is, we don't have any other option. I'm looking at the problem with the current context. As I said, people are in a desperate situation and we don't have option. And earlier there were speculation that China will bail us out, and now it's proved. We said that it's not going to happen. No country is going to come and bail us out. Same for India. They are even opening credit lines slowly and slowly. They are not like completely. Of course, they have the reserves. They can
$500 billion US dollars in their reserves.
Exactly. They can completely give like 10 billion rupees and completely finish these queues and everything. But no country is going to do that, because then they will have their own geopolitical consequences. So my view is we really don't have any other option to bridge this gap. So we have
no option left, Dr. Nicholas.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure.
Give me an option. So, okay, let's listen to you with open ears. What's the option available for Sri Lanka?
Well, what I would have done, and not at this moment in time, at this moment in time, I agree with Dhananath that we have actually no other option, because we have left ourselves with no other option. But let's say we understood the problems a year earlier, then we did have options. We could have actually started.
But now, no point of crying over spilled milk, Dr. Howard Nicholas, because it has already happened.
Yeah.
Now we are in this situation thanks to politicians or thanks to our fate. Unfortunately, we are in this situation now, so no point of crying over spilled milk. But what is the way out now? I want to know right now what's the way out. If not going to the IMF, if not, what's the alternative now?
I think as we stand now, you don't have any alternative.
There is no alternative at the moment.
As far as I can see, the government has actually cut off any alternative that might have been there, as far as I can see, but I don't know. However, I would have tried as hard as possible to negotiate with China, negotiate with India, negotiate with other friendly governments, credit lines, short-term loans, to actually have a stronger bargaining position with the IMF.
But Dr. Nicholas, let's look at our debt structure. Chinese own debt represents only 17.2% of our foreign debt, and ISB interest rates are double of those of Chinese loans at the moment. So if you look at the countries who have supported Sri Lanka predominantly, it has been India, it has been China, it has been Japan, and it has been South Korea for a certain extent as well. There are no other countries in the world who has come to Sri Lanka with a helping hand. Even let's look at Russia for an example. When the government was facing a crisis, they went to Russia requesting $400 million US dollars. Russia completely turned down the offer. They went to Pakistan, and the Minister of Industries back then, Bandara Gunawardena, said that Pakistan is going to give us a $200 million credit line.
Nothing materialized.
Nothing was materialized. It was all to please the masses of the country. So that is the situation that we are in. Only 3 countries have helped us with long-term debt over the years. It has been China, Japan, and India.
So my starting point, the problem...
If they are not willing to give us money, who do we go to?
I think you never go with the begging bowl. What you have to do is make a business proposition. So what I would do is start working with various corporations, Japanese corporations, Korean corporations, Chinese corporations. There's Hambantota. They want to come here and produce. Okay, start working with them. They're the ones who are going to put pressure on their governments to actually provide the loans. How do you think Vietnam got such a massive loan from the Korean government? Was it Vietnamese pressure on the Korean government? No. It was Samsung's pressure on the Korean government. Because Samsung was...
But Dr. Nicholas, look at now recently, I don't know whether you're aware, they tried to appoint a consul general to Milan, the foreign ministry, a veteran actor who couldn't even speak English. Dr. Nicholas, what is this joke? There are ministers' daughters in embassies in Sri Lanka who don't know what they're doing. There are daughters of opposition party parliamentarians who are in countries, they don't know what they're doing. What are we looking at? We don't have options available. Do we?
Well, again,
you've appointed these individuals.
Again, I would go back to the business community and I would say, this is your time to put pressure to get a change. Now, we can help. We can start working with counterparts in these other countries, other business groups. And then we can get them to try to put pressure on governments.
Dr. Nicholas, look at Sri Lanka. Sorry for not looking. I'm quite pessimistic about how the country is moving forward right now. Look at the business community. They appointed a council of 25 members who are strong businessmen in Sri Lanka who can pressurize the government, do something. What did these business community individuals do? They suggested the government to appoint another council. So, can you expect that from the business community in Sri Lanka, Dr. Howard Nicholas? All well and good. In paper, it looks beautiful, nicely written. It's beautiful. You look at the pictures of these business people and you think, these are the people that, are advising the government now. But what do? Absolutely nothing. So can you expect that from them?
Well, then I go back to what I told you at the beginning, is I also blame the business community. I think that they cannot be exonerated from the problems of the country,
right,
because they should have used their power to impose more discipline on this government and get them thinking longer term. So I totally agree with you.
When all of them have petty agendas, Dr. Nicholas, there's nothing for us to even talk about it. From the frying pan into the fire.
No, if I may interrupt on the Japanese intervention, I think, Shamir, we also tarnished our diplomatic relationship with Japanese with cancelling the LRT project and some other projects. So, and Japan has been a long-standing friend of Sri Lanka, and I think that also affected.
The light rail project was South Korea.
Sorry, not the light rail. There was another project with the Japanese government, with JICA, and it was a sovereign agreement. Generally, you don't go back and cancel any sovereign agreements. It's a commercial agreement. You can always go back and forth. And also the same thing happened, Shamir, when the Chinese foreign minister visited Sri Lanka. Actually, the president requested to restructure the Chinese debt, but they had a clear statement saying we are open for restructuring concessional loans, but not the commercial loans. And they in fact requested, if we are going to restructure it, we are inviting US, Japan, India and other bilateral partners to restructure. That's the general rule on any restructuring. So that's why I said we also didn't maintain, of course the wrong appointments have caused that. We really didn't maintain proper diplomatic relationships. Otherwise these things could have been, we could have requested better assistance. And now I think we are almost at the wall, and we really don't have any other options.
When the president wanted the Chinese foreign minister to restructure the debt, the governor of the central bank after 2 days said that they don't want a restructuring process going on. They will pay the debt somehow. I don't know if you recollect this,
yes.
Dharanath. Unfortunately, that is where the country lies at the moment. We're going for a short commercial break. Tonight our discussion is revolving around the role of the IMF and the future of the country's economy. Let's go for a short commercial break. When we come back, it's a final round. Stay connected. Stay with Face the Nation. We will.
COVID-19 සඳහා ආරක්ෂිත පියවර. ජනයා වැඩි වශයෙන් සිටින ස්ථානයන්හි ගැවසීම මගහරින්න. රෝගය ආසාදිත පුද්ගලයන් හමුවීමට නොයන්න. මුහුණ, මුඛය, නාසය සහ ඇස් ඇල්ලීමෙන් වළකින්න. අනවශ්‍ය ගමන් බිමන් යෑමෙන් වළකින්න. මුඛාවරණය ඉදිරිපස ඇල්ලීමෙන් වළකින්න.
තනිව යන්න බෑයි කියන කාරණේද අධ්‍යාපනයේදී මම කියන්නේ ප්‍රධාන වශයෙන් සිදුවෙන දේ.
අපිට රුසියානු සපත්තුව මේ ලංකාවට දාන්න බෑ ඒක ලොකුයි. චීන සපත්තුව සීන සමාජවාදී ඒකත් හරියන්නේ නැහැ. ඒක මේ කකුලට පොඩි. අපි අපේම සපත්තුව මහ ගන්න ඕනේ කියලා.
එක්සත් ජාතීන්ගේ මානව හිමිකම් කවුන්සිලය කියලා කියන්නේ මානව හිමිකම් පිළිබඳව ලෝක පාර්ලිමේන්තුව.
අපි පරිසරය ගැන දෙකක් තිබුණා.
මම ඉස්කෝලේ යන කාලෙත් මේක තුන්වන ලෝකේ රටක්. දැන් මම මැරෙන්න යන කාලෙදි තුන්වන ලෝකේ රටක්.
ආණ්ඩුව රූපාන්තරණය වෙනවා රාජ්‍ය බවට.
එත දෙක එත පහේදී තමයි මේ වතු ඔක්කොම නැසනලයිස් කරේ.
එහෙමයි ධර්මශ්‍රී රට ගැන විතරක් නෙමෙයි මම ගැනත් මම බය වෙලා ඉන්නේ.
අපනයන කවුද කරන්නේ? කවුද විශ්වවිද්‍යාලයට ගියද? කවුද අපේ ව්‍යාපාර කරන්නේ? විශ්වවිද්‍යාලයට ගියද?
No questions asked. News just in for those who are watching Face the Nation tonight. The Ceylon Petroleum Corporation has increased the petrol prices with effect from midnight today. A new price of 92-octane petrol is at 338 rupees per litre, octane 95 at 373 rupees per litre, auto diesel at 289 rupees per litre, and super diesel at 329 rupees per litre. So finally, they had to do it, no Dharanath.
The price revisions have been done. So of course the exchange rate depreciation and also the fuel prices, the world market fuel prices caused this. So it will be, as I mentioned, challenging time for people. So I think as I mentioned again, it's the reform plan that everyone has to be focused. Without those reforms, we really can't get over it. Talking about also, I think one of the main factors that we have to focus is also the productivity aspect, which we just very slightly discussed. In Sri Lanka, we from 1981 to 1993, from the total output, 24% was contributed by the total factor productivity, but it dropped to 3.8% from 1990 to 2002, and it was minus 1.7 from 2003 to 2009. So the productivity aspect is also important to make sure the industries are competitive. And my message to people is it's going to be a difficult time the coming months, and only a reform plan can rescue us, and we have really run out of options. And as I mentioned, the 5 crises are coming, but what we really need to do is to get prepared ourselves for the coming days. And till about like the next 8 to 9 months, it would be really challenging in my view. But it all depends on the reform and the actions that we are taking, because I had a conversation with some of my friends in Lebanon. So what they said was they basically had a hard default, not like a preemptive default that what we did. So what happened in their country was their currency went from $1 per 1,500 Lebanese pounds to 24,000 Lebanese pounds in few years, and their food prices increased by 400%, and likewise there was a massive economic challenge. So if we don't control it, it would be very challenging. Some of the measures are in the right direction, but we have to keep in mind in an economic crisis, it's not the normal condition. Things are very difficult, and the normal theory won't apply. So it's a challenging time. I think we have to focus on reforms to overcome this crisis.
Bite the bullet.
Bite the bullet.
I now move to Damit Palwata, senior banker.
So obviously we have run out of options. So we have to go to IMF at this moment, even though we need to have a lot of plans on in the longer term, what are we going to do in terms of reforms. One of the key things that the country lacks, if I look at from the banking point of view, is Sri Lanka doesn't have a development bank. if we talk of export orientation, industrialization, long-term plans, bringing businesses in, setting it up, there has to be supporting infrastructure being put up. One thing that is missing in this country is we need to have a development bank. I think that is essential for us to take that journey through. Also, maybe some additions like the bad bank would add, the managing the stressed and, the assets which are almost in the brink of getting into default. So together with that, if we work properly with the business community and also with the IMF program, properly focused in addressing this short to medium term issue with a focus on a long-term reform plan, I think we still have hope.
Thank you very much, Damit Palwata, Senior Banker. Dr. Howard Nicholas, Economist and Associate Professor at International Institute of Social Studies.
Well, I'm going to be negative and then positive, Shami. Negative, I want to bring another dimension into the discussion at this last hour, as it were, and that is we're not factoring the international environment into any of our discussions, which actually we will pay a heavy price if we don't take the international environment into account. Now, I don't know if this is common knowledge or not, but the consensus is now there's going to be another global recession. And this one is going to be deeper and more protracted than the last one. So the 2021 was relatively shallow, but we're now likely to see a really very deep recession somewhere in the second half of this year. And particularly badly affected will be Europe. Why? Because of the energy prices. So if Sri Lanka is expecting European tourists to come back, I think Sri Lanka will be very disappointed, because my guess, I live in the Netherlands, and my wife has just told me that our energy prices have risen by 300%. 300%. And this is for average households. So they're not thinking of holidays in Sri Lanka at this moment in time. They're actually thinking of survival at this moment in time, because these are catastrophic energy prices. There are going to be lots of political problems for the ruling parties. But most importantly, is Sri Lanka factoring in another major global crisis? And then what are we going to do? What are we going to do in that environment? And that's my negative, that we need to be talking about that and thinking, okay, how are we going to get through that? Because at the moment, we're talking about getting through the current problem. But this problem could be yet worse before we manage to actually get on top of even the problem that we have now. So that's my negative. My positive is, and I've said this many times, is to turn Sri Lanka around doesn't take very much. Sri Lanka is a small country, and it's concentrated in a couple of cities, basically. And for Sri Lanka to turn around can be much quicker than for big countries like India or even medium-sized countries. So this is one of the great advantages of Sri Lanka. It doesn't take very much. And we were talking about India's reserves. It's nothing for India to actually support Sri Lanka. It's nothing for China to support Sri Lanka. We don't need that much investment to really make a difference in Sri Lanka. So I'm very positive. And if I see actually that dynamism return to Sri Lanka, I will certainly bring money here and invest it in the markets. And I expect to make, in 10 years, I expect to actually increase my money 500%. That's the sort of return you would likely get in a country like Sri Lanka. This is very, very plausible. However, we have to get past this period, which is going to be a very, very difficult period. And what worries me is nobody's taking this into account. I've been in many, many discussions, and people look at me quizzically and they say, what global crisis? Sorry, you know, are you reading the international business press? People are really, really worried. You know, I mean, this is not going to be like 2020. This is far worse. You've been hit with one of the greatest shocks to the system. And it's an energy shock, it's a food shock, and it's a decoupling of the global economy as well.
Thank you very much, Dr. Howard Nicholas, economist and associate professor at International Institute of Social Studies. Because of the fact that it's a final round and I cannot pose any questions to you, Dr. Nicholas, I leave it at that. I had a lot of questions to pose to you in your final remarks, but I leave it at that for the moment. Thank you very much, Damit Palvat, the senior banker, for joining us this evening on Face the Nation. Dr. Howard Nicholas, economist and associate professor at International Institute of Social Studies. And nice to have you back, Dharanath Fernando, Chief Operating Officer at Advocate Institute. Where were you, Dharanath? Honestly, were you in hiding?
I was in hiding, Shamir. These days have been very busy, and I had a prior commitment on every Monday. But I rescheduled it just to take part in this show.
Thank you very much, Dharanath, for joining us. I thought of giving you one little opinion or advice before you go tonight. You don't have to worry about anything now. There'll be 200 police officers. This is 200 lawyers standing at the police department defending your right of freedom of expression in Sri Lanka now. So you're safe on that front. Thanks, Dharanath, for joining us this evening on the show. Thanks a lot, Disal, and thank you very much, Nadeem, as always. Nice to have you back on the show.
Good to be back.
Presume that you'll be here next week as well?
Will be.
Right. I leave you tonight with a quote, as I always do. You never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. Take care and good night.